But I'm here to talk about the essential ingredient that makes it all work, which is transmission. And where is the West at with transmission, which has been a very challenging history for the West. So first, actually, I'm going to skip around a little bit. Let me talk to you about how things are. So in the West, actually in the United States, there is a certain amount of transmission planning that's required by the federal government. This is through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that has jurisdiction over these assets, namely the rates that are developed from these assets. And so the construct that the FERC has put in place going back to 2010 or so with Order 1000 is that entities, transmission owners, transmission operators in the West have to be part of a regional planning organization, and they've got to plan together. So that was a big change because transmission planning was primarily happening on a utility by utility basis, maybe a little regional coordination, but not in this very structured, formal way, subject to FERC's jurisdiction. And the failure to plan in this manner, you'd be subject to non-compliance under FERC, which is a pretty substantial and potentially very expensive proposition. And so after Order 1000 in 2010, someone will check me on the date if I'm wrong, but around that time, these regions in the West formed. And we have three. We have the big blue region, which is called Northern Grid, the yellow region called West Connect, and the green region, which is under the California ISO. Footnote in history, the blue region used to be two regions, but that's old news. So we'll just talk about the regions as they exist here. The Western Power Pool that I run facilitates the blue area. So we basically get these 12 or 15 transmission providers together. And every 2 years, we're doing a FERC-required transmission plan. And to date, that's just been a 10-year look at that sub-region transmission system. So just the footprint area in the blue, and then separately, West Connect is doing their planning for the yellow, and California ISO does theirs. The distinction, which is a whole other chapter, is California ISO is really different than West Connect or Northern Grid. California ISO is what I call like a fully integrated independent system operator, where all of its operations, including its FERC transmission, is under the federal jurisdiction, under the market operator's tariff. And so California ISO has a lot more authority over transmission as a singular entity than what happens in the blue and the yellow. The blue and the yellow is basically multiple transmission providers, so multiple entities coming together to plan, but they're each in charge of their own tariffs and their own system and their own costs. So it's much more balkanized, and it's definitely harder to get concerted action out of those regions. That's my editorial opinion. So there has been some frustration over these 15 or so years that the transmission ideas that come out of West Connect or Northern Grid just are not enough to deliver the kinds of solutions we need for our energy future. I would observe that in all of these years that those regions have been operating, the only transmission solutions that have come forward to construction were the ideas that the incumbent transmission providers had anyway. The process itself hasn't produced a new idea that came forward to permitting and construction. Just essentially the incumbents had their projects, and those are the ones that have gone forward. And I think the observation is we may need a lot more than that. And how do we know when we're talking about transmission assets, which are so expensive and take so many years, 20 years in some cases, B2H is getting close to 20 years to get permitted and then built. Regulators in this space, the entities that oversee PacifiCorp or Portland General or NV Energy, they want to know that the transmission assets they're being asked to put into customer rates are the best solutions. And they know the transmission, by its very physical operation, is a networked west-wide asset. It may be one large 500 line in a couple of states, but it's affecting the entire system. And so this frustration has led to a couple of things that have changed the current landscape. A speaker earlier today mentioned FERC Order 1920 that just came out in May. And so FERC is a good partner here, and they really want to do what they can. They have limited jurisdiction in the West, as I mentioned, particularly in the blue and the yellow. And so their idea is, all right, well, we gave it a shot with Order 1000 and it didn't really do what we wanted it to do. Let's try again, and we'll make these entities plan on a 20-year basis. And they have to do it in this way and that way. They have certain requirements, but I think the idea is, I don't know, I'm not with FERC, but if I had to guess, I'd say they're sort of thinking, well, if we force them to do 20 years, there probably will be some new ideas coming out of that process, because they probably, even these incumbent companies, can't imagine what they'll build in 20 years. They know what they want to do in 10, but maybe in 20, we might get some new ideas into the environment. I don't know if that's what's going to happen. I think the problem with it is that with FERC, jurisdiction over transmission, comes this very scary idea of mandatory cost allocation. So under FERC's rules, in theory, if you planned together and you found this ideal project and it came out of this process and you said, that's the best one, that's the superior project, we're going to select this project. You could theoretically, never been tested in the blue and the yellow, take that project and say, here are all the utility beneficiaries of this project. They each now owe, and issue the bills. Here are your bills for this $2 billion, $3 billion, $5 billion project. And if you don't pay, I'm going to take you to FERC. So that's really scary in the West. Again, I mentioned transmission in the West. These are hundreds of miles long. They take 10, 20 years to permit. There's so much cost and risk associated with it that I would also observe that the lack of new ideas that come out of these FERC processes are probably because the entities that are involved with it are very nervous about cost allocation. And so they really don't want to see a lot of ideas come out of this process. That's been fine 10 years ago, but we're just not here now. We're in an era where there's broad recognition that transmission has to be one of the solution set. It's not the only answer. All these other resources and new technologies are part of it, but transmission there has to be more than what we're seeing. And so 1920 will happen. The compliance date for revising all of these tariffs in the blue and the yellow is in June next year. And they will add in a 20-year analysis to these processes. But those things I talked about, those fears and barriers, those are the same. So question whether or not that process is going to get for what it wants, and I think what the nation needs. We'll see. I hope so. But instead, we've come up with an alternative idea. So about a year ago, this idea came around that we should do a West-wide 20-year look on the transmission system. So keep in mind, this was before 1920 came out, but we knew 1920 was coming. There was a notice of proposed rule. We knew what it was. There was a flavor, a lot of details. And so through the Western Power Pool, because we're basically a nonprofit facilitator of regional planning and operations, we went forward with this idea that we would form something called the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition, or WESTEC, and we would get together as many entities as are interested in transmission to do a West-wide look. So no more blue, yellow, green. We're tearing down those boundaries. We're going to do a West-wide look, scenario-based. We're going to hire an independent consultant, actually Energy Strategies, based out of here in Salt Lake. And we're going to do this together, and we're going to do it in a very inclusive way. We're going to allow all kinds of stakeholders at the decision table, more than just the utility transmission operators, which historically are the only ones that tend to get to be the deciders. We're going to be brave. We're going to be bold. We're going to try to do something different here, but we're going to do it outside of the FERC process. So this is a voluntary process. The idea is that it may generate more ideas, creative ideas, out-of-the-box ideas, and most importantly, it would form this coalition and create a community that we're bringing along, that at the end of the day, high confidence, high quality transmission study, something that we don't have today. We have lots of studies, many studies, and more are coming, but an industry-led study with this many stakeholders West-wide is not something we have. And also importantly, we're working really hard to bring as many state regulators along with us. They're in this partnership, they're part of it. I also want to point out a very critical strategic partner for West Tech is WEC. So thank you to Brandon and everyone at WEC for helping us do this. So our final study plan got done last month. It dictates the next 30 months of work. Here's my timeline. So study plan done. In about a year, we'll see a 10-year look on the West-wide transmission system. So those will tend to be the transmission solutions that are more feasible to be delivered in a 10-year horizon. So grid enhancing technologies, use of existing right-of-way, those kind of lighter or easier lifts. I say that with quotation marks. None of those are easy. And then in another year, we'll put out the 20-year look, and that's going to show the transmission portfolios, new ideas, lines on a map. I should footnote and say, not necessarily new ideas. I think if you're a transmission planning engineer, we all kind of know where those lines need to be. But the point is, it's the process, and it's the coalition that we brought along, and it's the high amount of stakeholder inclusion, meaningful feedback opportunities that we're providing. So that at the end of the day, it's a study. It's just information. It's not going to get anything by itself built or permitted, but we're hoping that that study becomes a stronger foundation to support those very difficult and lengthy processes that are yet to come. There's other ideas in the mix about bringing together all kinds of different utilities, non-utilities together, and to create the financing and the risk structure that could run with a project like this identified in West Tech. I would definitely end with saying West Tech, in a way, is a leap of faith. We're trying to do something the West has never done. We're trying to do it in a different, inclusive way as fast as we can. This is as fast as we can do this. And we're hoping that at the end of the day, we're all better for it. And we may see some new transmission solutions actually come to build, to permit, using this as its basis. So much to come, lots of stakeholder engagement opportunities, also broadly with the public along the way. So thank you, and I look forward to questions.